What if I told you that more Latinos voted Republican in the last presidential election than in any past election? That the Latino vote is not monolithic? If that's true, then how do we understand what the Latino vote was in the last election? What should Republicans and Democrats do moving forward? And how do we understand why Latinos vote the way they vote? They're considered one of the largest, most important voting blocs in America, and there's no one better to talk about those questions than Aldrin Ballesteros. He joins us to break down those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. One of the shocking findings of the 2024 presidential elections is that President-elect Donald Trump performed better among many demographics than he had in the past, than any Republican candidate had in the past. And the most telling of those demographics was the Latino vote. The Latino population is known as one of the most coveted votes in the United States when it comes to politics. They are one of the most crucial voting blocs in American politics. So why the switch? There's no one better to discuss this than Aldrin Ballesteros. He is the managing partner of BM Group. He works with the Mexican Institute at the Wilson Center, and he joins us today from El Paso, Texas. Aldrin, welcome to Face the Issues.
Hello, Sam. Thank you so much. It is truly an honor to be here with you today.
It's so great to have you here. And Aldrin, let's just dive right into this. And I want to focus, start by focusing on the 2024 election, which is really kind of the catalyst for a lot of these conversations. As you know, President-elect Donald Trump did better with Latino voters than he had in 2020, than he had in 2016, than Republicans really have for a long time, potentially the best they've done in history. And he actually did better among a lot of demographics, African-American voters, female voters. But focusing in on this Latino population and this Latino vote, it's something that in our conversation in the past, you've said hasn't been that surprising. So let's start with the 2024 election. When you look at this, what happened? Was this a Trump phenomenon? Was this Harris messed up in this situation? Or do you see this as a trend that may be moving and that Latinos are going to start moving more Republican?
Sure. So I think it's very simple. And if you don't mind me sharing the anecdote I shared with you before, earlier this year, I was on the phone with my mother. I was in Washington, D.C., finishing my master's, and we were talking about just random things about the day. And then she suddenly says, and mind you, my mom is 100% Mexican. She just became a U.S. president a few years ago. So as a Mexican mom would, she would usually vote Democrat, or not vote, but have sympathy towards the Democratic Party. And in this conversation, she just said, "You know what, mijo? I'm really scared about the economy. It's been very rough for us these past few years, and you know what? I think Trump is right. I think we need a change, and he's going to be better for the economy." And that was a moment of, oh, something's happening. If my mom in El Paso, Texas, is for the first time in history saying that she loves Donald Trump when he's had a past of antagonizing the Mexican population, well, something's up. And plain and simple, the economy. That's the number one issue.
So that's, you've heard so much, and I know you've heard this. You've worked for, and you know a number of Democrat candidates, Democratic members of Congress. You've been in their offices. You have relationships with them. And the Democratic National Party, the talking point has been, Donald Trump does not respect Latinos. Donald Trump has disparaged Latinos. They ran that in ads. Did that fall on deaf ears? Were people upset about that, or what? Did this not have it obviously did not have the impact that Democrats are hoping it would have? Why not?
So my perception is during the 2016 election, yes, that absolutely worked because it was right. There was a lot of antagonizing against the Mexican community and other communities. But this was 2016, at least from my perspective. My community's economy was well off. Everyone was doing okay. No one was worrying about, hey, do I have enough money to pay rent next month? But then come this election, that's a complete different story. If I can't buy groceries for my children, if my friends can't do either, if I'm asking how they're doing and they're saying they're broke, well, every other aspect completely becomes irrelevant. It's who's going to help me economically. And not that I'm saying that the Trump administration would do so better than the Biden administration. It's more the messaging of, hey, you guys aren't doing so well economically. You guys were probably doing better during my time. I can probably fix that. And that resonated with the Latino community, at least in El Paso, Texas, at least in Texas, and in a lot of other places that I'm aware of.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, anyone who watches this show or who has watched any of my commentary on other networks knows that I've been beating this drum, this idea that these issues, like whether it's abortion, whether it's gun rights, whether it's fill in the blank, it's not that they're not important, but that their importance is secondary in voters' minds to if they can pay the bills, if they can put food on the table, if their kids can go to school. And then when the economy is good, then they worry about these other issues. And when the economy is not good, it's what the famous Democratic strategist James Carville said: the economy's stupid. That rises to the top. And you're telling me that's what you were seeing in Latino communities in Texas.
That is 100%. To speak even further about it, the El Paso community, along with most of the border cities in the state of Texas, are primarily transportation based when it comes to the biggest industry. So think trucking, think of warehousing. And during the last administration, not because of the administration, but coincidentally, there was the biggest recession in the trucking industry in history. And I was part of a trucking company during that time. And I saw slowly how our friends' companies closed, how our company eventually closed, and how this had a trickle down effect in everyone's pockets. And a lot of people that I know are unemployed in the area. So again, it's simply, I need a job. I can't feed my children. Everything else is secondary.
Yeah. We saw a lot too across Texas, Florida, counties that are what we call majority counties, where there are majority or the white vote in the county is actually the minority, and for in Texas and Florida, it's often the Latino vote that's the majority, that actually flipped for Republican. So to your point, this is quite widespread. But one of the other questions I want to ask you, Aldrin, is to tell us a little bit about the differences in the Latino vote. I mean, one of the things that you and I have both talked about in the past is that the Latino vote isn't monolithic, but often gets treated that way. You're Mexican American. A lot of the Latino voters in Florida are Cuban American. In my home state of Pennsylvania, they're Puerto Rican or they're Dominican American. And then from all different areas, Venezuelan, Guatemalan. They don't vote the same way. Can you talk a little bit about why that is and what might get them to vote a certain way or a different way?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, we don't vote the same way. It'd be very easy and simple if you could say Latinos care about these issues in general, and that would be a lifesaver for political strategists. But the fact is that every single community within the Latino group has different priorities. And I was looking at a research that I made when we first met, actually, kind of segmenting the different populations, which would be primarily most Latinos in the United States are of Mexican descent. Then we have Salvadorians, we have Dominican, we have Cuban, and now, for example, we have people from Venezuela coming more. And each one of these groups, pardon me, has completely different interests. And starting with the Mexican population. Mexican population in the United States is the biggest. However, we are notorious for being uninvolved politically. Why is that? In my opinion, and from my research, because most of the Mexicans who have come to the United States come so out of economic necessity. I could use my own family as an example. As you know, I was raised in both Juarez, which is Mexico, and El Paso, Texas. And when my family migrated to the United States, it was specifically fleeing the violence of the 2010s, which was led by cartels. So the main catalyst for myself and other families like myself to move to the US was not so much, oh, we want to integrate into US culture and policy. It's more, we have a need for security and a need for economic prosperity. So once we're in the US, we focus on that. And because there isn't a direct path towards becoming a resident or a citizen, or it's not that easy. It took my mom 21 years to do so. Well, it's much slower for those incoming populations to become involved in policy and be able to vote and be part of the civic community in the United States, as opposed to, for example, Cuban Americans. We take Florida for an example. Back in the day when we had the wet foot, dry foot policy, well, Cuban Americans could come to the United States. They would have an immediate path towards residency citizenship. And furthermore, when this policy began, the Cubans who were migrating to the United States were in fact migrating because they were seeking the American dream, the being part of the political structure. It was something fascinating for them. So thus, they wanted to become immediately politically and economically involved. And that's why the political community in the United States is so prevalent, so strong when it comes to their communities and their involvement, what they can do in policy, entertainment, you name it. And similarly enough, we had, speaking of Florida, now we have a huge influx of Puerto Ricans coming into Florida and now becoming eligible voters in the state of Florida. And we saw so in the past election, a couple of elections ago, the question was, are they going to lean Democrat? Are they going to lean Republican? And well, we saw that eventually they helped the state become further Republican.
And to your point too, I mean, with Cubans coming out of Cuba, I mean, escaping communism, right? And you know, almost running away from that. And so that message of freedom and that message of liberty really resonates with them in any campaign. So I appreciate, it's a very constructivist point of view, but I appreciate you really showing us the background of and how that background and the why really helps lead to the how on these different groups vote. Aldrin, we're gonna go to break. When we come back, I wanna talk about how political parties and how leaders should engage with Latinos as voters and in their communities. So don't go away, we'll be right back.
Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. You can view our in-house studio productions on demand, or watch what's on the station right now with our 24/7 live stream. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device, or go to our website for more information. Visit lighthousetv.org to stay connected. There you can find out what's currently on the air and coming up, how to watch in your area on cable, satellite, broadcast, or streaming devices. Watch past programs or our live stream. Follow us on social media and learn more about the station, our hosts, and our programming. Lighthouse TV, positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Aldrin, thank you again for joining us first. And let's just jump right into solutions, really. I mean, listen, we know the Latino vote is important. But let's talk a little bit about how political parties and elected officials should be approaching Latinos in their votes. I want to pick up with something you left off on, of this idea that they're not monolithic, and that the why these different groups come to the states is going to lead to the how these different groups, these different ethnicities choose to engage their government. You talked about Mexicans coming for economic opportunity, Cubans often coming for political reasons, to escape communism, and that why is going to lead to the how. Knowing that, how should elected officials choose to engage Latino populations? Because what we see right now is very, very monolithic. It is very, all Latinos should go this way or that way, but it doesn't seem like that message lands. So, like, if you were advising an elected official, what would you tell them about how to engage these different communities?
That's a very good question. And one of the things I would say is we need to be very cautious of where we receive this this feedback from. And I spent half of my time in Washington, D.C., half of my time in El Paso and Mexico. And there's a huge disparity in the conversation between what we speak about in Latino circles in Washington, D.C., and more specifically about the policy around it. And it's a completely different story when you come back to the border, speak with, in my case, the Mexican community, see the real sentiments, because sometimes the notions that we believe are the needs of Latinos in DC aren't really connecting with what's going on the ground. So my biggest advice would be not to stop receiving advice from experts in Washington, D.C. That is never going to be a solution. We need these experts. I strive to be one of these experts someday. But it's also going into the communities, because that's where you receive the real messaging. You may realize that sometimes some of the discourse that is happening in DC is guided by a specific narrative that sometimes we participate in willingly, subconsciously, but we do so anyways. And as I mentioned during the break, one of those would be migration, for example. When you see it on the ground, it's kind of shifting. But if you're in DC, maybe you don't want to open that Pandora box because you don't want to be judged. So it's a very interesting conversation.
Let's talk about migration and this idea of where Latinos go in the country. You've mentioned before that even just Latinos, obviously the ethnicity thing is one, right? I mean, what ethnicity you come from, why you came to the States determines how you engage. But also, you've talked before about just where Latinos are in the United States. Where they make their new home changes how they approach politics. Can you break that down a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. So, for example, if you have Latinos now, and again, I'm going to use El Paso area as my center ground because that's where my perspective is from. Migration for the last 10, from the 1990s to the 2000s, it was Mexicans coming to the U.S. And no one within the community found any conflict because it was, in many cases, oh, my family now crossed over. That's basically how. You bring the 2010s, or 2015 onward, you start seeing people from the Northern Triangle, which is Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras, coming forth. And then after 2020, and because of the dictatorship in Venezuela with dictator Nicolás Maduro, we started seeing a huge influx of Venezuelan migrants. And everything I'm about to say is simply my observation. Being here in the border community, it's the first time in my life that I saw my own community, which is Latino. And if you think of it as a monolithic, like, oh, Latinos should have no issue or difference in accepting other Latinos. But for the first time, because the new wave of migrants was not Mexican, there seemed to be a clash. And there are efforts for integration. There's a couple of great 7-Eleven similar stores called Del Rio and Oxxo, who actively are recruiting these migrants and integrating them into the social and economic fabric of the border. But then you also have these nuances and differences in culture, in ways of communicating that create this sometimes conflict, and it makes it harder for the current Latino population in El Paso, for example, to completely assimilate and bring together the new communities. And it's mixed. It's not all in favor, not all against, but it's the first time that I ever saw, oh, wow, there seems to be a slight clash. So everything's evolving.
Yeah, we see that, I think, in pockets across the country. In my home area of Pennsylvania, that clashes between the Puerto Ricans and the Dominicans. But again, people tend to think they're all the same and ignore some of the nuances that are different between them. Audrey, let me ask you this. You talked about the economy earlier. What issues, for these different Latino groups, what issues matter most to them? And what issues do they want to hear their elected officials talk about?
So we talked about the economy. That is number one. And secondly, from what I'm seeing, and this is, I don't know how to structure this as a talking point, but I'll use an example. Last week I was in Pennsylvania. I was in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and we called an Uber. The Uber picked us up, and he was Latino. I'm not sure from what country, but we sparked a conversation, and he said he had lived in New York for 17 years, but he had just moved to Scranton 6 months ago. I asked him why, and he said, well, and mind you, this gentleman was a migrant himself, and his answer was, well, there's too many migrants. So that sparks a new conversation, which is, do we have the infrastructure to comfortably bring these new populations in? And this gentleman, who was a migrant himself, said, you're right, that is the issue. Before, I had no issue finding housing, living comfortably, but because there's so much demand now, I was pushed out further and further, and until I decided to move somewhere else because my quality of life was diminishing. So when we have this conversation of migration, obviously we are a country that is known for bringing people in and giving us the best opportunities possible. But we also need to be realistic and understand, are we having the correct infrastructure to bring these new people into our community while we provide the same quality of infrastructure and opportunities for the people who are here? So I think that is something that isn't being talked about in the DC spheres. If I'm completely honest, speaking of that, in DC, I would probably not bring it up. But here, it's common knowledge. And so there's that disparity again.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I think we hear so often the message that, well, the message to immigrant groups like Latinos or Asian Americans or fill in the blank is that, you know, this party, this candidate, this whatever wants more immigration. We want more immigrants. And you're telling me that may be the backwards message in some of these communities.
Yes, that is 100% true. And then with the messaging as well, I would say if you're a candidate either for a presidential race, you should not only don't go into the studio and record a couple of lines in Spanish that you probably read a couple of minutes before. Segment your messaging state by state, because even if to you it's all the same and it's monolithic, those nuances, we understand those nuances. So frame the message state by state and frame the message country of origin by country of origin. Yes, it might take a little bit more time, but I for one believe that policy and politicians should be able to communicate directly to the voter. And if you're deciding to lump millions of people into a single character, well, it's not really going to click.
Yeah, and to your point, it hasn't. Voters know this, and I think one of the best piece of advice you gave is the more you know the community, the more you actually are there and you get involved and you visit, not just for a photo op, but the more you get to know them, the more you understand what the needs are. And so it's less about crafting message even, it's more about just now you've seen and now you know what they expect.
100%. And to add one more little point, I think it's also important, and I think this is more a thing in the Latino community. We want to know the real person. Like we can hear when the conversation is politically crafted. We want to hear you in a podcast. We want to hear how your regular life is. We want to get to know the guy or the gal who's going to be running the country. And it's important to maybe in this new era be a little bit more real with the people.
Yeah, fantastic advice. Authenticity. At the end of the day, no matter how many teleprompters or hashtags we use, authenticity matters. Audrey, we're going to cut the break, but thank you again for joining us and helping us break down, again, one of the biggest voting blocks in American politics.
Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. You can view our in-house studio productions on demand or watch what's on the station right now with our 24/7 live stream. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device or go to our website for more information. Visit lighthousetv.org to stay connected. There you can find out what's currently on the air and coming up, how to watch in your area on cable, satellite, broadcast, or streaming devices. Watch past programs or our live stream. Follow us on social media and learn more about the station, our hosts, and our programming. Lighthouse TV, positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Aldrin, thank you again for joining us. And one of the things we do on the show is we want to get to know our guests beyond the talking point. And you grew up actually in both the United States and in Mexico. You lived/live in Juarez, Mexico, as well as in El Paso, Texas. And I know that's played a big part in not just how you see the world, but in who you've become and the things that you do. Tell us a little bit about that upbringing and how it's made you who you are today.
Sure, absolutely. So my story, if I shared it here, it's basically everyone else's story. So my family is Mexican, and a lot of Mexicans, what they do is they decide to pay for their kids to go to, in my case, a Catholic school in El Paso, Texas. So all my schooling has been in the United States. And eventually we moved to El Paso. And so that creates an environment where I had a house in Juarez, Mexico. Every day I would cross the border. It's probably 2 hours of waiting in a car to cross. And then you're immediately in El Paso, Texas. So this allows for me not only to have, and I think it's a very unique upbringing because you get to see both the United States and Mexico, both of them with all their virtues and with all their flaws, because you can compare and contrast. So I think that's allowed me to see in a lot of instances, oh, the US does this incredibly well, but maybe should do this that Mexico is doing, and vice versa. Mexico is doing this incredibly well, but maybe should do this. So I think it's allowed me to be very pragmatic with a lot of my thinking. At least I think so. And because this area is so unique, and because I've seen it be used prominently in politics, that's one of the biggest things that has me trying to do what I do, which is explain the reality of my community, because many times I just see either politicians or political pundits who you could tell have probably never been here talk about my community. And so I want to be that voice that can do the best possible to disseminate and explain what living here really is like.
Yeah. Well, Aldrin, I certainly appreciate you joining us on this platform to do just that, and appreciate the work that you're doing day in and day out.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate you having me. As I mentioned, it's been a dream for a while.
Well, we appreciate you joining us. Aldrin, thank you so much. Again, my guest is Aldrin Ballesteros, the managing partner of BM Group and with the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center. That is our show for this evening. I want to thank each of you for tuning in, and we hope to see you again right back here next week. Until then, my name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.